Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts' TNC webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, and influencers from New England and around the world. I want to thank you for joining us. I'm Massachusetts State Director and your host, Deb Markowitz. So first, here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and also globally, using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. And we know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and planet. So to that end, today we're going to be talking about a fantastic new initiative that TNC is spearheading to help struggling oyster farmers impacted by the global pandemic and the economic downturn. TNC is buying 5 million surplus oysters and using them in nearby oyster restoration projects from the West Coast to the Cape. And you may have already heard about this initiative. It's called Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration, or SOAR, because we love acronyms, because it's been featured this project has been featured everywhere, from the Today Show to the Boston Globe, and also on WBUR. So you may have heard about it. First, we're going to get to hear from Robert Jones. He's TNC's global lead for aquaculture, and he's going to give us an overview about how this oyster restoration work is progressing across the country. Then Steve Kirk, our coastal program manager for TNC in Massachusetts, will give us an update on the SOAR work happening right here at home. And we're also joined by Massachusetts oyster farmer Bruce Silverbrand. He's the owner of Buttermilk Bay Oysters, and he's going to share his experience as a farmer enrolled in this program. As you think of questions for Robert, Steve, and Bruce, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I just want to thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you to our speakers, and let's dive in.
Great. So thank you very much, Deb, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and joining us this afternoon. I'm Robert Jones. I lead our aquaculture program at the Nature Conservancy, where I manage a portfolio of projects in 7 countries around the world intended to ensure aquatic farming benefits nature and people. I'm talking to you today from my home in Seabright, New Jersey, which is a small town south of New York City. And I'm going to be talking to you about our Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration program that we've developed to benefit farmers affected by COVID-19 and further our oyster restoration objectives. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of backdrop on our programmatic activities that have informed the SOAR program. Our food program at the Nature Conservancy overall, which I'm a part of, is focusing on the concept of regenerative food systems, where we're actually helping design food production systems in a way that goes beyond just the reduction of impact and actually creates benefits to the surrounding environment. We're doing this work on land and terrestrial systems, and we're doing it in marine systems with our aquaculture work. We've been advancing a concept we're calling restorative aquaculture. And the idea is that by commercially farming certain species under the right condition, we can actually make positive contributions to ocean health. Oyster farming in particular can help filter water, remove nutrients from waterways that suffer from excess nutrient pollution, and provide habitat to surrounding fish stocks in a similar way to natural systems. TNC's own science has demonstrated the ecological value that oyster farming can have, and we're working around the world with farmers to enhance those benefits. At TNC, we also have an active oyster restoration program in which we're aiming to rebuild wild oyster reefs. This is an extremely important initiative, given that 85% of wild oyster reefs around the world have been lost. TNC has developed over 200 marine restoration projects globally over the past 20 years. But one of the big barriers we've had to these projects has been securing the oysters and the shell needed to rebuild these reefs. Bottom line is that TNC and our partners, we need more oysters for these restoration projects. Enter COVID-19. beginning in March 2020, COVID-19 had major negative impacts on the oyster farming industry here in the United States. Some farmers reported that they lost 90% of their businesses almost overnight due to the large-scale closure of restaurants, where nearly all farmed oysters go. This put over 3,000 oyster farming jobs at risk here in the United States. And as TNC, we were concerned about this, not only because of the communities that would be impacted, but also because of the ecological benefits provided by those oyster farms. If those oyster farms were to go under, we'd lose the water quality and habitat benefits provided by those farming systems. We thought, well, could we turn lemons into lemonade here? Could we actually purchase these farmed oysters that are now on surplus and restoration sites and deploy them on restored reefs? So in September 2020, we joined up with Pew Charitable Trust, another large environmental organization, to form SOAR with this goal in mind. And there's really two parts of this SOAR program. The first is the oyster purchase program. We've set targets for this program for purchasing oysters from over 100 shellfish companies to support at least 200 of those critical oyster farming jobs in coastal communities and purchase 5 million oysters to rebuild 27 acres of oyster reefs. We've deployed SOAR in 7 states over the last several months in locations that are most critical for oyster restoration and where the grower need for support was the most significant. We started the program, the first phase of the program in New England in late fall in October. To avoid the early onset of winter, we needed to move there first. And then we moved south in the deployment of the oyster program to New York, New Jersey, followed by Maryland, which most purchasing took place in December and January. We're now purchasing oysters in Washington State. And Steve was going to tell us about we're kickstarting our oyster purchase program now that spring is upon us and we can resume ocean activities in the Northeast. So 6 months into this program, we've had a lot of success in achieving our initial goals. We've benefited exactly 100 farmers to date, supported 340 jobs across 15 restoration sites, and rebuilt 21 acres of restored reefs. We're still working on achieving that 5 million oyster target, but we're confident we're going to achieve it later this spring with a second round of purchases. This project has just been a total team effort. You can go back to the previous slide. This project has just been a total team effort and has taken a concerted effort on all parties, state, federal partners, and the growers themselves to make this happen on the timeline. Like, this was really a time of the essence project, and we knew we needed to move fast to have an impact on those growing communities. Dale Parsons is one grower that I wanted to point out. I'm there in the middle in the green jacket, and he's there on the top left in the camo hoodie and the blue mask. Dale was really instrumental to helping us make the SOAR New Jersey program happen. Even before SOAR, Dale was one of the early advocates for oyster restoration projects in Barnegat Bay, which led to an experimental reef restoration site. So when he heard about SOAR, he was one of the first to answer the call to help TNC and Pew deploy this program. He offered his docks to more than a dozen growers to drop off and aggregate their product over 2 days. That's where we collected the 300,000 oysters that you're seeing us stand upon in this picture. Dale even captained the barge in 30-degree weather and 20-knot winds to help us get those oysters out onto Stockton University's reef sites. Next slide. So the impact that the project has had so far has been significant to the farmers that are participating in the program. We've been able to provide about 20% of the annual revenue of nearly half of the farmers participating in SOAR. That's pre-COVID revenue. Most of these farmers are pretty small businesses with less than $100,000 in revenue per year before the pandemic. 2/3 of the farmers participating in SOAR said that this program was very beneficial in sustaining their business through the pandemic. I mentioned there's a second component of SOAR, and I'll just mention it briefly. We've established a shellfish growers resiliency program to help ensure farmers don't find themselves into a similar situation again in the future. We'll be providing some small grants to farmers to help diversify revenue streams into online sales, build farmer cooperatives, test out new species that have ecological value, and increase the sustainability of their farming operations. That program is now accepting applications, so we hope to continue that program and be able to award some high impact grants into the summer. One final note, and Deb mentioned this, is we've had a great amount of excitement about how this program and opportunity has helped us educate the general public on the benefits of oyster farming and the need to rebuild reefs. We were featured on the Today Show. It was pretty cool to see Al Roker and Savannah get excited about conservation and sustainable food. We've had, the opportunity as well on the front page of the Globe. We really need a lot greater public awareness and support for these types of projects, and this has been a great step in that direction. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve now to talk about the Massachusetts component of the program.
Steve, could you unmute, please? Thanks.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, thanks, Robert. Appreciate it. And I'm Steve Kirk. I run the coastal program here in Massachusetts. And I want to sort of start by really hammering home the why we're working in this space. You can go to the next slide. Estuaries are important. These are the places where these businesses are located. These are areas that have incredible value to people in nature. So really important for migratory birds, for fish species, those that enter into the seafood market on the coastal side, but also those in the offshore setting. Estuaries and our coastal areas are the nursery grounds for species that we catch offshore. These places are incredibly beautiful. They are, they're places where we live, work, and play, and shellfish play a really important role. Robert was outlining that 85% of oyster reef globally are gone. With them being gone, the services that those oysters and shellfish play in the coastal system are removed as well. And so, a sort of simple response here, and you can go to the next slide now, as Robert mentioned, is restoration. That's something that TNC has done a lot of terrestrially and in the marine environment. And so we have done a bit of shellfish restoration here in Massachusetts. We've done quite a bit of it in other parts around the country. And we went through sort of a recognition that the scale at which we were implementing this restoration wasn't going to get us to our goals or have really sort of meaningful impact for the coastal environment. We were doing small projects to sort of understand how to do that here. And so that's when we started working really closely with Robert and the global program to feed into his portfolio in doing science to understand how the farms interact with the marine environment. So we're doing an ongoing research project with our science partners at the Northeastern University and with NOAA, looking at how farms can provide habitat for other species. I mean, I used to have an oyster farm myself, and I can tell you that the gear that oysters are held in would have fish and lobsters and all sorts of species congregating around the farm. And I can tell you that, but without sort of the scientific rigor to back that up, it's just another story of fish being around the farm. So we're trying to really understand that and bring some quantification to that. So that's a story of how we're sort of interacting with the aquaculture industry. So you can go to the next slide. And to give you a quick snapshot, the aquaculture industry in Massachusetts is meaningful to the blue economy. They're, and also to the environment. So if we're thinking about, several 1 acre demonstration type restoration projects, there's more than 1,200 acres of aquaculture in production in Massachusetts now. thinking that seafood production, as Massachusetts being a seafood state, New Bedford, a fishing port in our state that is year over year the top value landings port in the country, ahead of every other fishing port in the country, including Alaska. That Massachusetts is a significant seafood producer, and oyster aquaculture comes in behind the sea scallop industry, the lobster industry, and next comes oysters. Small farms that are dotted around our coastal waters. You can go ahead. So we're here to talk about the SOAR program, and I can tell you, some of the stats of who's participated and at what level. So you can go ahead again. This all happened, as Robert mentioned on the timeline, really quickly. We were moving oysters between October and Christmas, and we're able to spin up this program and execute in a short amount of time. We've been able to work with 8 growers, purchasing more than 175,000 oysters and getting money into the hands of the small business owners. At this point, better than $80,000, which for a small farmer, that's not individually, that's overall. And for a small farmer, it's been really meaningful. You can go ahead. Let's see, did it miss? There was another slide that talked about what we were. Yeah, so we're going into a round 2, which is set to start as early as tomorrow. We're getting ready to deploy oysters for our round 2, where hopefully, should all the logistics line up, we're going to get several new grower participants in the program, and we're really hopeful that we're able to meet these numbers that will feed up into the overall program goals of getting more than 500,000 oysters planted, and hundreds of thousands of dollars into the industry that's been really negatively impacted by the pandemic. Now you can go ahead. As was mentioned, the program has been really well received, and for a few reasons. I mean, Robert, I think, really well articulated that it's important that these businesses survive, and this is one way that that I think we've been able to ensure that, at least in part. While we've done a little bit of restoration here in Massachusetts, this program, I think, has really invigorated the conversation in trying to advance restoration here in Massachusetts, which was sort of slow to be adopted, but I think this program has highlighted the potential benefits and really sort of cementing the relationship between the aquaculture sector and the restoration sector, one that has worked hand in hand over the years, but this has been a really sort of obvious and beneficial program to cement that relationship. Certainly, this has been a collaborative effort from the local officials and the shellfish constables and the towns that were working. Certainly, the farmers, they have dedicated a lot of their time and effort into executing on the program. I think really importantly, our state fisheries agency, the Division of Marine Fisheries, has dedicated a lot of their time, not only from the permitting side of things, because this is an unusual transaction, us purchasing market-ready oysters and putting them on restoration sites. It doesn't happen every day, but I just have to sort of really call out that the Division of Marine Fisheries has been really supportive of this program. I'm excited to pass it over to Bruce. Bruce has been a longtime supporter and collaborator from many years, helping our marine restoration efforts. And I'm hoping that he's going to give a chance to talk about how he's interacted with the Nature Conservancy over the years, how the pandemic has impacted his business, and how the SOAR program has touched down in related to his work and his business. Bruce.
Hi there, Steve. How you doing?
Great.
You have my video on yet?
I think they're working on it for you.
I can see you, Bruce.
Okay.
If you can't see Bruce, please let us know in the chat.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here and talk about the oyster problems and solutions. I met Steve some years ago and was contracted to grow oysters for these restoration sites, which I mean, obviously have been a godsend to us growers in the end. In the beginning, it didn't really start that way. It started as a project to rebuild the stocks and the reefs, which leads to cleaner water. And as Steve stated, there are fish and other species that congregate around these cages. So it's really good for the whole ecological cycle of all the species. You know, we grew 300,000 oysters for the Conservancy, and they planted them on 2 different restoration sites, and those oysters did very well. They've done very, very well, which was good to see. And I think as far as the Conservancy goes, with the pandemic, they saw the need for the growers and the problem, and they stepped in and did quite a thing for everybody. It not only for the shoreline and the ocean, but also for the growers. You know, that money that I made helped us get through a winter where there wasn't a lot of money coming in. And now they're going to further the program. And I haven't talked to Steve about this, but I had talked to my wife that maybe as shellfish farmers, we ought to start to turn our heads towards not so much a subsidy, but growing some of these oysters instead of for a commercial sales, as to do what this program is doing going forward in the future. No, you won't make as much money, but sometimes money's not everything involved. The oysters do a job out there cleaning the water, that if we don't have that going on, then maybe there won't be any farms anymore. The impact of the pandemic has showed us this. It's kind of turned our heads in a different direction. And going forward, hopefully the Conservancy can prove to state and federal government that this is a worthwhile project, not only for the Conservancy, but maybe for the states and the government to get involved in. You know, the SOAR program rescued a lot of farmers that would have been in trouble. And I'm not saying there won't be more farmers in trouble, because I believe it'll be several more years before things come back to normal. But the program, I mean, was all it was supposed to be was a restoration project. And obviously with the pandemic, it kicked it into a different status. And we were able to sell oysters to the Conservancy and take them and plant them in a good number, large numbers on these sites, and which will, you know, hopefully cause these areas to propagate and therefore do all this work on their own. Going forward, I hope to see these programs continue, not only for myself, but for other growers, and also for the ecological value to the environment. Like I said, maybe the pandemic was a blessing in the end. Instead of just thinking about profit, maybe we'll be thinking about trying to improve the environment along with. I mean, I've known all along it improves the environment, but you know, to see what happened when this all turned in March, and to see that we can use the oysters in a better way, not only financially, but environmentally. And the impact on Buttermilk Bay oysters, it will be long lasting, because like I say, it's kind of turned our heads in another direction now. Maybe we don't have to grow all of our oysters to go to market. Some of these oysters are going to be used for the environmental good that they do, as well as other species too, the impact. So going forward, if the pandemic hadn't happened, the impact on us would have been just, you know, life as usual, grow oysters, sell oysters, you know, do some good for from the farm for the ocean. But now Buttermilk Bay Oysters thinks maybe part of what we grow should be turned into what we're doing with the SOARS program, where we're planting them on the bottom and letting them do their good. Oysters can live 20 to 30 years. That's a lot of good they can do over that time to help the estuaries and the bays. And I think, moving forward, that's part of where we're going to be focused on, is not only market value seafood sales, but also environmental sales, where maybe we don't make as much money, but we're doing good for everybody, the ecosystem, the farm, and everybody. It's a win-win for everybody.
Hey, Bruce, this is exactly what is so exciting to so many people about this program. And I just want to personally thank you for being a leader among your peers, getting people, getting other oyster farmers involved, and you've been a real leader. So just, thank you. And I'm wondering if this is a good time to move to the Q&A. Maybe both Robert and Steve could join us on screen on the video. And I just want to thank all of you for such a really interesting presentation. This is, during the pandemic, things have been so hard, and it's just heartwarming to have this feel-good story where it's a win, as you have described so well, Bruce. It's a win for the farmers, but it's also a real win for the environment. We've got a bunch of audience questions already. If you haven't yet asked a question and you have one, feel free to put it in our Q&A box, and we'll be able to get to them. And I'm going to start with Rob. Where do you see the SOAR program post-COVID as restaurants fully reopen? We heard from Bruce that he's interested in exploring in a continued way using some of his oysters for the rebuilding restoration work. Is this something we have in mind as well from TNC?
Yeah, I think Bruce kind of hit the nail on the head there. And great question. We did a socioeconomic survey of all the growers that participated in the program, and we're super excited to see that nearly all of the oyster farmers that participated were interested in participating in future programs that would purchase oysters from them for restoration. So one thing that's been really cool about this is seeing growers in a commercial industry getting as excited about recovering and restoring the environment as we are at TNC. So there's a real interest in us continuing this program. And I do see it as potentially playing an important role for oyster businesses going forward as well. If we're able to continue this program at a significant size in which farmers can rely upon it in their business plan. Before COVID-19, there was actually a lot of conversation about the industry and a possible price collapse due to so many new oyster farms coming online kind of at the same time. So I think as we return to that, and it's probably going to be a while before we even return to the demand we had before COVID-19, a continued program that could buy oysters for restoration purposes and farmers could rely upon that could help create a price floor and stability in the marketplace going forward that could be really beneficial. So we see this as not just limited to COVID-19. There's a lot of opportunity for it going forward.
That's great. I wonder, Steve, TNC's aquaculture work in Massachusetts goes beyond just the SOAR program. What else is TNC doing in the shellfish aquaculture space?
Yeah, sure. I made a brief mention of a specific project that we're working on with, really trying to understand how the farms interact with the marine environment. In many ways, an oyster farm is different than a terrestrial farm in that if you're interested in how an apple orchard or a cornfield interacts with the marine environment, you can go outside and look with your eyes. When the tide comes in, the farm is underwater. It's hard to tell what is actually going on. And so, it sounds really simple, but we're putting cameras underwater. So, the intention of that project is, we can get a look at what's happening, but ultimately, what we hope that program will result in is generating this robust scientific information that we can feed up to those that decide whether an oyster farm can be in a place or not. And it's really stringent regulatory framework for where a farm can be placed. And so we're hoping to feed that information up to the decision makers. And our hypothesis is that these farms bring a benefit along with them, but any type of development in the ocean is really almost always viewed as having a negative impact. And so not all aquaculture is created equally. And that's important to remember. It's a huge sector. And what we're talking about is nearshore shellfish production. And providing information to the people that are going to decide whether aquaculture can develop more or not is, a role that we think from, particularly from environmental impact perspective, is a place that TNC is well suited to be in.
What's so cool about this work, both you and Robert, whatever we learn here in Massachusetts is being used around the world. And if we think about it, the population of the world that relies on farmed seafood is ever growing. And so making sure we can do it sustainably is going to be so important. So there's a good question that came in from Russ Cohen. And I think this might be a good one from Bruce, but others also jump in if you want to. Russ says, great initiative. That said, I keep hearing about the problem of oversized oysters at oyster farms. I, for one, and I suspect I'm not alone, love large oysters. In fact, I'm usually dismayed by the scrawny-sized oysters available in restaurants. Isn't this problem potentially addressable by adjusting consumer tastes? And what about using some of those large oysters in oyster stew or chowder, which are so yummy? And so, as somebody who's made his livelihood, Bruce, and selling oysters, is there a market for large oysters? Do we just have to educate folks?
Yeah, the larger oysters, it depends how big we're talking. When you start to get over the 3.5-inch mark, they call those like a New England oyster, 3.5 to 4, 4.5. And then after that, they get to be the point where they're really, like you said, for an oyster stew or oyster fryers, much like they do with steamers. They'll take the larger ones and they use those as fryers. But the problem here in Massachusetts is there are no oyster shucking houses anymore. Mm. Those are all gone because the oysters have been gone for so long. We don't have oyster reefs, oyster beds. And I believe there's one in Rhode Island and one in Maine. But as far as DMF is concerned, we're not allowed to ship that stuff over state lines, have it shucked, and then sent back to us. Not to mention, you're going to lose any price you're going to make by delivering them up there, shucking them, taking them back, packaging them up. So financially, it's not a winner, really.
So if
we had a shucking house right down the street, that would be great. But in DMF, they have stringent rules about shellfish and how you handle it. And there's a reason for that, because if they're not, especially with Vibrio and all the other things that come with the shellfish, you have to be careful. And that's why they have a lot of these rules. You can't just set up and start cutting oysters in your garage. It's not safe. It's not food safe. And you don't want to put a product out there that's going to cause harm, because it'll cause more harm. First, it'll hurt someone, and then it's going to hurt all the farmers right after it does that.
So there's an incentive for everyone to get it right. So it sounds like even though they might be yummy to some people, there's logistical problems with actually selling them because they need to be shucked.
Exactly. And, I understand the scrawny oyster thing, because myself, I don't really eat oysters. I'll eat, my wife will fry them and I'll eat them. I watch people shuck those petite oysters and go,
it's a lot of work.
A lot of work. You get a gumdrop out of it. But a lot of people like them that way. They don't want them big. But for the people that want them big, all you got to do is reach out and talk to the people that you buy your shellfish from, or your shellfish grower, and I'm sure they can accommodate you with whatever you want, because there's still a lot of oysters left laying around.
There are. Yeah. Hey, so following up on this, Robert, we got a question, a couple of questions about the oyster reefs. One is, what caused the oyster reefs to disappear? And then Marjorie Russell asked, are the oysters used for reef building alive or just the shells or a mixture? Do all think about moving oyster species to new locations, and will it upset the local ecology? Lots of questions about the restoration piece. What happened? Why do we have to do it? And kind of what does it look like now?
Yeah, I'm going to let Steve handle that biosecurity question, because I think that's a really good one. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. What was the first question?
So why did the oyster?
Oh, the oyster reefs decline. Yeah. Frankly, primarily overfishing. Oysters were very, very abundant in the U.S. from New England down to the Mid-Atlantic. The stories were that ships entering the harbors, Baltimore Harbor and York Harbor, would actually have to avoid these oyster reefs or they might run aground. They were very abundant and very easy to access, which made them easy also to exploit. Secondarily, water quality has also caused an issue, and disease issues as well with the oysters hasn't helped the matter, but primarily it's been that. The question about oyster reef and oyster reef building and how it's normally done. Usually the first step involves selecting a good site and preparing the bottom appropriately for oyster restoration. And usually that involves putting some substrate there, not always. And that substrate can be oyster shell or other substrate like rock, for example, to have a good base for those oysters. So shell is very often used in oyster restoration, sometimes just the shell itself, and sometimes what's called spat on shell. So that's a shell that gets a baby oyster larvae set onto it using a process in a hatchery to get that set onto the shell, and those are deployed. And now I think this effort with deploying the large adult oysters is relatively new, and it has an interesting way of supplementing those shell and spat on shell for restoration by introducing these adult reproductive oysters onto that reef can help us maybe accelerate and create a diversity of year classes on those reefs. So we'll see with the monitoring we're doing how that's going to help advance the growth and productivity of those reefs.
There was a question about monitoring, and before we move to Steve on what we're doing to make sure that we're not spreading disease and all sorts of and species where they shouldn't go. The question is, are we going to be? This is from Brian Walsh. For those estuary locations where these oysters have been placed, will TNC do follow-ups to document and create awareness of the subsequent improvements in water quality and other ecosystem benefits that might arise? And this, he suggests, could help sustain ongoing commitment to the SOAR program.
Yes, so like most of the restoration sites that we're using, TNC does not manage ourselves. There are other organizations that manage them. They also do monitoring, but we've included in our budget monitoring on each of those sites that we'll conduct a year after the oysters get deployed on it. So, but we'll be looking at like things like survivability, growth and abundance around those farms, continuing to look at the water quality and fish abundance around those farms. Or sorry.
I'm gonna jump in because I was gonna talk about the concern over moving things from place to place in the water, which is a very real concern. There are a few factors here. Robert mentioned that these reefs were overfished in the past, and often the response was to bring oysters in from other locations to rebuild the natural population, and there have been environmental negative outcomes from doing that. And so there are really stringent rules on the movement of shellfish from place to place, not only from things that are really important like shellfish diseases that can be in the shellfish when you transfer them, but also like I was talking about, other animals that are around the farm, whether it's bigger animals like fish or crabs, but the smaller encrusting fouling organisms like things that grow on the bottom of a boat or a mooring or a piling. to move that from place to place is a real concern. So, I would say it's important to recognize that we were able to work with 8 growers in this first round. And really the reason that number is so low is because growers that were interested in participating were their eligibility was knocked out because we did some shellfish disease testing and they did not pass the testing. In a lot of ways, that is actually not really a huge cause for concern. It was sort of expected. It's, some of these shellfish diseases are naturally occurring in the water, and so we weren't really surprised by that. But there's been a lot of interest in the program, and that biosecurity concern is one, obviously, that as a conservation organization, we don't want to be, at the hand of spreading problems. But we were working within the regulatory framework. That was where our really strong partnership with Division of Marine Fisheries played out a lot.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions for Bruce. Why Mills asks, Bruce, what got you involved in the program in the first place before COVID came along? And then there was from Adina Masliansky for Bruce, did you have any doubts or questions about TNC when they started working with you?
I kind of can answer both at once, I guess.
Yeah.
About 5 years ago, my I want to call him shellfish constable got in touch with me. I've been a commercial shell fisherman for 37 years, something like that. And a cohogger, scalloper, all that. And of course, so this was kind of right up my alley. When I received the farm, I did all the regulatory paperwork and got the site. The first thing that happened my first year was my constable put me in touch with Steve, and they were interested in growing oysters, not for the SOARS program, but for the reef restoration program. And they needed somebody to grow them. And as Robert had stated earlier, they do the spat on shell, where at the hatchery, they put them in a pool and the larvae are pumped in there and they let them settle and they drain the water out and all the larvae attached to the shell. So that's what we did for TNC the first year. And they paid me to grow them. And then at the end, when we had them, what I call babies, I call them all my babies. Once we got them to a larger size where they could be on their own, Steve and I and some others went and spread them out on the reef in 2 different sites, one in Wareham, Mass, and one in Bourne, Mass. And I just happened to be dead smack in the middle of those sites. So it was really, go back to what Steve was saying about spreading things in the water column from one area to another. It was a no-brainer because I was in between those 2 sites in the exact water where the sites were. And TNC has been great. They really have. They're a great partner. And I was excited to hear about the SOARS program. Steve and I had actually talked in the beginning of the COVID thing. And I said, hey, do you know anybody? Because he knows everybody. I said, you know anybody looking for oysters? Because I have a feeling things are going to go south. And sure enough, within a week of that phone call, everything stopped. And he was able to work it out with Robert and all the others at TNC and make this SOARS thing happen, which, like I said, has been a gift from the gods, if you will, for us farmers, especially us small guys, even the bigger guys. It's just unfortunate that not as many people could be involved. TNC, I didn't know much about them, but the more I study, I found out that they were global, and most of your work is on land. And it's great to see that now you turned your head towards the ocean and are saying, because without the ocean, we're all in trouble. We get 70% of our food out of it. It makes our weather, everything. We have to treat the ocean better. And TNC is on board with that's what you do. And I don't consider myself an environmentalist, but I spent over 30 years out there, and I care greatly for the ocean. I spend more time at sea than I do on land. So, but at TNC, there was never a doubt. As soon as I looked up what they did and who they were, there was no doubt in my mind you'd be a great partner. And And you have, and you've turned out to be great for everybody, not just, oyster farmers, which is, we thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that. I'm really proud of the Massachusetts program. That's the Oceans program. And, the work that Steve does is part of that. And, ocean health, as you say, is absolutely critical. And actually, a lot of ocean health starts on land. It's, what's the water, what are the pollutants that are coming off the landscape? And of course, a lot of the challenges in Massachusetts are going to come from sea level rise. And, we've lost so much habitat, our marshlands, our estuaries, and there's a lot of work to do. And it's great to have partners like you and the fishermen who are out there every day. So thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard a lot. We've got another question. I've heard a lot about ocean acidification. How does it impact oysters, and how can oysters help address ocean acidification? And what public policy do we need to do and to address this? I don't know if that's Steve or Robert.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in. This is very timely because just about, what are we in April? It's already April. It was in early February. The legislature established this commission in Massachusetts, the Ocean Acidification Commission. And so I was actually part of that group that pulled together recommendations to really try to understand the ocean acidification problem and what Massachusetts can do to address it. And so it's a great question because it directly impacts our coastal waters, our offshore waters, and that impact really comes down to, from an economic standpoint, a lot of the species that we're talking about here. So this is a sort of a oyster heavy conversation, but any shell forming species is impacted by ocean acidification. And there are sort of a couple of different drivers. Ocean acidification is born out of the same issue that climate change is, with excess emissions and excess carbon in the atmosphere getting absorbed into the ocean, and that makes the water more acidic. In the coastal zone, there is a slightly different driver of the problem, which is largely around freshwater running off the land that has excess nutrients in it. So it's a different way to address that problem. So the question is about policy. I think that to protect the coastal zone and the species that reside there, the businesses that rely on those species, we have to think really thoughtfully about how we manage wastewater, how we manage freshwater on land as it runs into our estuaries. So that's a sort of snapshot of that. I don't know if there's a follow-up, Robert.
Oh, I just wanted to talk about another effort we have going on at TNC called the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. We have about over 100 US farmers, oyster farmers, signed up to work with TNC to push for climate action. They're going to the Hill with us as well to actually try to push on policies for climate change. And I think that's great. And the reason why that is because oyster farming has really been kind of the canary in the coal mine for climate change's direct impacts on businesses. One of the first and most directly kind of affected by this through the lack of larval settlement and also the brittleness of the shells. So yeah, it's a significant problem, and we need more businesses like this, coming together and similarly working on climate issues.
So we've got two questions about the SOAR program. One is, are Wellfleet oyster farmers participating? And then the other is, it looks like SOAR did some work in Maine. Can you describe what that was and where oysters were placed in the wild? And is that Steve or Robert?
I'll ask Robert, but I will first respond on Wellfleet. So the initial SOAR rollout in Massachusetts, Wellfleet oyster farmers are not participating. The restoration sites are located in Buzzards Bay, and we had a concern particularly around that biosecurity concern that I was talking about earlier. So right now, Wellfleet oysters are not participating in SOAR. I think, getting back to some of the comments that Bruce was making about the potential for a model like this to gain a little traction, have some staying power, a town like Wellfleet, and I've actually talked with some of the local officials there to think about having this model of purchasing oysters from farmers for restoration in Wellfleet, and I'm hopeful that those conversations will keep going. Rob, do you want to mention Maine at all, or I can do it too?
I mean, sure. That's another state that we have deployed under SOAR, and similarly, a lot of biosecurity issues we had to be concerned about there. So we didn't reach as many growers as we wanted to. I think we had 6 or 7 on the first round, and we have 6 or 7 new ones coming in the next round, something like this. There's actually also not active oyster restoration sites in Maine, which means we had to find a home for them in New Hampshire. So they're going to the Great Bay restoration site or have gone to that site that TNC manages there. So yeah, I think we're building that had to have approval from both regulatory agencies in Maine and New Hampshire for those biosecurity reasons. But I think we're building some awareness here in Maine of like the opportunity that could be with oyster restoration going forward. So we'd certainly like to do more there.
Yeah. There was an interesting comment from Jim Turek in the chat. He said another value of the SOAR program is that it adds on to the B120 Buzzard Bay restoration that was previously completed in Buttermilk Bay to address impacts to shellfish and recreational shell fisheries by the Buzzard Bay oil spill. The Buzzard Bay Trustee Council is pleased that this project builds on our previous effort. So I wanted to make sure everyone heard that, because it is, thinking about like, how do we, how do we do these projects that provide multiple benefits to, all of the different stakeholders and parties. So we have a question from Vincent DeForno, and we just have time for just a couple more here. So I'm going to try to get to as many as I can left. Do oysters that are used to clean the environment as part of these restoration projects have a potential to become commercial sites in the future? And if so, who would own them? So if we succeed in restoration, then what happens? Anyone know the answer to that question?
Well, yeah. So for the most part, we're trying to make sure that these oysters that we're using philanthropic dollars for go on to oyster reefs and they stay oyster reefs. Actually, this question has come up in the Chesapeake Bay, where we've done and partnered on a lot of large scale restoration projects. There was some interest in turning those back over and opening them up for harvest as public beds. TNC was against doing that and using those public resources for that. So that's generally where we've gone with this, is try to keep those resources and those oyster reefs to be protected, because we know they're just so few and so down in the wild right now.
That's great.
Yeah, I might just add on that all the locations where these restoration projects are happening, it's all publicly owned, and this, as soon as you're working in the water, this is area that is in Massachusetts anyway. It's owned by the state and managed by the municipality, and so any of the work we do, it's sort of like not necessarily up to TNC to decide, but it's really a cooperative effort with those that have real stake in ownership of the subtide lands. But also all the players.
That's great. So we had one suggestion in our comments in our Q&A that was really a suggestion for Bruce, which is to have the farmers explore tax implications. So perhaps once the economy returns and you still are participating, maybe you can take a tax write-off for the costs and labor, as well as for the less than market price that TNC might pay for these overlarge oysters. So that was a little tax suggestion to look at. And maybe, Bruce, if you can let folks know what people can do to support Buttermilk Bay Oysters now and into the future, and then we're going to head towards our wrap up.
Well, I think now and into the future, everybody can support all the oyster farmers by going out and buying oysters. A lot of growers have switched to an online model, which is something that we want to do also. And unfortunately, sales are down. There's not a lot of money. It takes a building. It takes FDA regulations. You have to conform to all of these in order to be safe and give the product a safe handling before it goes out to the public. But as we are about to go into the second session of SOARs, we plan to use a good part of that money to open up that online. I really didn't want to open another business, but I think we see the future is less the wholesale market, at the fish market, and maybe more the online style of sales where somebody goes on their computer, oh, Buttermilk Bay Oysters, name on their website, let me order up some stuff. There's a lot of growers are already doing that. And I see that as the future for us, really. Maybe we can get a little more money for our oysters by cutting out the middleman. People nowadays shop in a different way. And they just like as we're having a meeting on Zoom, if you had told me that 2 years ago, I would have laughed you right out of my house. But this is the way things change. And if you don't change with them,
Yeah.
going forward, and this is, the reality of the business. It's the way you're gonna have to change things to survive. It's the reality of all businesses. If you can't adapt, you don't survive.
And that's true for nature too, adaptive management. That's what this is all about. And well, I just want to thank you all for being with us. And for folks who are wondering, how can you learn more about, keep in touch with this project and our aquaculture work. And obviously we welcome your donations, your contributions to help support this work. We'll be following this with an email that has links to resources and so that you can stay involved. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to our panelists, you are fabulous. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support. We appreciate your support of the Nature Conservancy. It's how we can get all this work done. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email, as I just mentioned, and it should come within the coming days. And it'll have, in addition to the links to the resources we talked about today, it'll have a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying our webinars, please share them with your friends or make a donation to support our work. You can donate via the link in the chat. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and to get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. And I just want to tell you, next week we have a double header. We've got 2 special webinars. On Tuesday at noon, we'll be talking with the Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation, which has been working to both utilize green infrastructure and build a workforce development program to champion in their community in Dorchester. We'll talk about their work and about a special project TNC has been collaborating with them on. Then at our usual time on Thursday at noon, we'll have a fascinating discussion about renewable energy in New England, featuring experts on solar and wind from TNC. You won't want to miss these webinars, so please register to secure your spot at nature.org/MA webinars. I want to thank you all again for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.